Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Harambe. Tonight we have a very special guest. He is one of America's most respected scholars of any ethnic persuasion, having authored more books than any contemporary African-American scholar. He is chair of Temple University's African-American Studies Department, having started the first doctoral program in African-American studies ever. He is Dr. Molefe Kete Asante. Welcome to Harambe, Doctor.
I'm delighted to be here.
All right, brother, let's cut right to the chase. Were the ancient Egyptians black?
Yes. I mean, every indication that we have, historical information, linguistic, art, in terms of art, in terms of science, the ancient Egyptians were African people. And anyone, as John Henry Clark, the eminent historian, likes to say, who was in Africa, who was not black, was either an invader or the son or the daughter of an invader. Africans were black. And in antiquity, of course, the ancient Egyptians were black people.
Mm-hmm. Well, what categories of evidence do you have to support your contention that the ancient Egyptians were black?
Well, it's a curious question that you ask about the categories of support. And the reason it's a curious question is because no one asks, if you talked about the Greeks, no one will say to you, what proof do you have that the ancient Greeks were white people? Nobody asks that kind of question. They ask that question about Egypt, but the categories are numerous categories. But fundamentally, the ancient name of Egypt, of course, is not Egypt. Egypt is the Greek name, Egyptus, but the Africans call the land Kemet, which means the land of the black people. And so Kemet itself, in terms of just the language, in terms of the Medu Neter, which is the ancient Egyptian language, in terms of that language, we know that they were black people. But not only that, but if you go and you look at the paintings on the tomb walls, what you see are black people. If you look at the indications, for example, in documents such as in the tomb of Ramses III, where you have the world's first ethnology, that's where you have a group of people representing different races. The Ethiopian and the Egyptian are both black people, and they look just alike. So that's evidence. I mean, then there's the evidence of the Europeans themselves. I mean, Greek people, like Aristotle and Herodotus. Aristotle says that the Egyptians that he saw, he says that they were black. In fact, he said they were very black. He said the Ethiopians and the Egyptians are very black. And this book is Physiognomonica. You can look it up. I mean, people can look that up. I mean, Herodotus says, for example, the people of Colchis must be Egyptians because, like them, they have black skin and woolly hair. So the ancient Egyptians were black according to the Greeks and the people who were, observers who saw these people. Mm-hmm. So I don't think it's any question. I mean, the Egyptians never even, they never, I mean, this question would be crazy. It is not even, it should not even be discussed. Anybody who thinks that the people of Africa, the Nile Valley region of Africa, and the Nile Valley civilizations were either European or were Asians, do not know the documents and don't know the facts of the Nile Valley history.
Mm-hmm. Well, there are some detractors, Dr. Asante would say, what difference does it make? I mean, with all the problems that people of African descent have today, what difference does it make that the ancient Egyptians were black? How do you respond to that?
Well, it makes a lot of difference. And the difference it makes is that, number one, you've got to have your facts straight. And in order to look at the contemporary situation, you've got to have facts straight. And I think for school children, it's very important that people teach accurate information, not teach information that is distorted, that is false. I mean, I've gone to schools recently where young people believe that Egypt is not even in Africa. I mean, how does a kid in the 8th grade get to the point where she believes that Egypt is in Europe? The only way you can get to that point is because of the distortion of the information in people's minds and imagination. So when I say that it is important that we have this information, it's important for, number one, you teach accuracy. Number two, it's important because it relates directly to our perception of the African continent itself, I mean, to rob Africa of its classical civilizations is much like robbing Europe, for example, of Greece and Rome. I mean, so it is important in terms of perception, in terms of conception, in terms of how people view themselves, how we view each other. It is important that we have accurate information. The ancient Egyptians were black people, and the evidence, of course, by people like Sheikh Anta, who did even melanin tests on the skins of the mummies of antiquity. I mean, all of these evidences are enough to demonstrate that if we talk about antiquity, you're talking about a black people. I mean, you're not talking about a European people or an Asian people. You're talking about people who, in fact, the further back you go in antiquity, the blacker the people are. So if you come forward, then you have, of course, you know, the mixtures coming in, the Arab population coming in. But the Arab population doesn't come into Egypt in large numbers until 639 to 641 of this era, this era, not before, not in the BC era. In the BC era, there are no large influxes of people, with the exception of the invasions. Occasionally, one could point to the invasion, for example, in 625 of the Persians, and then the invasion in 333 of the Greeks. But these were not great influxes. The great influx was the Arab influx, which came from Arabia into Egypt, and that influx came in the 7th century A.D., and not in antiquity.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that Egypt is designated as being in the Middle East as opposed to being a part of Africa, which we both know that it is. At what point in history, Dr. Asante, was Egypt taken out of Africa and placed in the Middle East, and why?
Well, the Middle East, and I've written about this too, as you point out. I mean, I've written about this a lot because part of what has happened is that people take the notion that Middle East, they believe that Middle East refers to a continent. It doesn't refer to a continent at all. I mean, we know that. It is a political entity and a political concept. And it's a political concept that came into being basically after the last great European war in the latter part of the 1940s, the early part of the 50s. But so it's a political designation, but it's not a continental designation. There's no continent, Middle East. Egypt, of course, has always been in Africa. You can't take it out of Africa. You can drive overland from Ghana to Egypt. You can go from Kenya overland to Egypt. There's only one country separating them. You can go from Ethiopia to Egypt. You can go from Sudan to Egypt. They're on the same continent. But what happened was that in the top of the 18th century, 19th century, after 1800, 1803, around that time, there was a deliberate attempt on the part of many European scholars to try to deal with what they had found in Egypt. I mean, the monumentality of the temples, the great extent of the tombs and so forth, which was more monumental than anything, and they had to try to take Egypt out of Africa.
Mm-hmm. We want to pick up a little bit more on that, but first we're going to take a break right here and give our viewers a chance to test their knowledge of history with our monthly feature, Black Facts. We're talking with Dr. Molefi Asante of Temple University. Doctor, you want to pick up on what you were talking about, taking Egypt out of Africa?
Yeah, the point I was making, of course, was that in 1799, when the French invaded Egypt with the Grand Army, of France. They discovered in the Nile Valley a civilization that was more majestic and more monumental than Greece and Rome combined. And it was a problem, I mean, because they had been teaching in European universities courses on the classics, and they meant by that, of course, the European classics, Greek and Latin, Greece and Rome. But when you find a civilization that was anterior to Greece and Rome and more majestic and monumental, in fact, there's more written material about this African civilization. Question is, what do you do with it? And I think that was the beginning of trying to take Egypt out of Africa. The idea was that it could not have been created by African people. I call it the legacy of disbelief. The idea that, wow, I mean, this is in Africa? How did these temples get in Africa? How did these columns get in Africa? How did the father of medicine get to be an African? I mean, how did the father of writing get to be an African? I mean, how did the originators of astronomy get to be African people? The originators of agriculture, of geometry, of surgery, of music, I mean, in terms of written music, mathematics.
And this contrasted with the great enslavement at the same time.
This is exactly right. And of course, while Africans were being enslaved during the same period of time in terms of the rediscovery, in a sense, by Europe of Africa, what had to happen was what Martin Bernal calls in his books Black Athena, you had to have an Aryan interpretation of history. The Aryan model of history was an interpretation that simply said it could not possibly be true that black people created a civilization like this. So that's when you get the idea that somehow Egypt is not a part of Africa.
Mm-hmm. What are the most noteworthy accomplishments of the Egyptian era?
Well, I think that there are numerous accomplishments, but and you have to remember it was the ancient Egypt, of course, is the longest continuous civilization that we know of. I mean, if you go back to 3100 before the Christian era, and you start there with the first dynasty. Now, of course, you can go even earlier than that if you start with the 16 kings before Menes, who was the first king of the first dynasty. But if you look at that whole tradition, there were 3 golden periods in ancient Egypt before the first golden period in Greece. That sort of gives you the length of this history. I mean, you had a first golden period, which comes around the 6th dynasty, and then you had another one around the 12th, and then you had and the 18th, and then you had a stronger dynasty around the 25th and 26th. So you had, which were great in terms of the revival of architecture, the development of literary forms, and I think then that the fundamental contribution might very well be a spiritual contribution. I mean, even though you have all of these technical and material contributions, when you look at the ancient Egyptians' approach to life, and of course, the approach to life is an approach to death. I mean, the same thing. The idea of the eternal life and the concept of eternal life as symbolized in mummification itself and in the construction of the tombs, some of them 60 or 70 feet under the earth, of individuals who would construct their tombs there so that they could live in eternal life. I think the concept of eternal life was the biggest contribution that the Egyptians made, if you look at the spiritual side of it.
Mm-hmm. Tell us about the Egyptian mystery system.
Well, the mystery system was no mystery, of course, to the Egyptians. I mean, it was a mystery to the Greeks, but it was not a mystery to those people. I mean, they truly understood that if you looked at any of the great myths of Egyptian life, for example, the myths at Heliopolis or the myth at Memphis, where you had the construction of reality based on the deity Atum and Ptah. I mean, what you discover is that in order for a person to be well educated, the Egyptians thought that it was necessary that a person go in as an initiate and learn various categories of knowledge. So the mystery system was in fact the first university system. I mean, this is why people have spoken of it as the Osiris-Ika, the place, of course, where Osar or Osiris gave forth at least the knowledge of Osar, and the various attributions of Osar were very important for people in terms of learning how to pass through life.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the remaining tenets or principles that date back to the great Egyptian era that are still in place in what we know as Western civilization?
I mean, almost everything. No, I'm really being facetious. But when you've been to Egypt, or when you study Egyptian history and culture, and when you look in the African Nile Valley, you come back to the West if you have never gone to Egypt, and you see everything. I mean, you look at the columns, for example, on banks and buildings, and you see the columns that people call Greek columns, and you know that these are Egyptian columns, and you know that they existed in Egypt 2,000 years before they existed in Greece, and that the Greeks got them from Africa. When you look at lions, when I drive down the street in residences and I look at lions out on people's lawns or entrance to their driveways, I recognize these as replicas of the Sphinx and concepts that came right out of the avenue of the Sphinx in Thebes, Luxor. So you have that. You have the pyramid, of course, which is everywhere. And you have the Eye of Horus, which is on the back of the dollar bill. I mean, so almost everywhere you look, you see ancient Africa. I mean, it is almost impossible to escape. So much so that even if you take, for example, just the idea that ancient Africa gave to us the concept of measurement, the first people to measure with a Nilometer, for example, the rising of the River Nile. I mean, this was the concept of measurement itself was fundamental. I mean, you can look at not just measurement, but you can look at even at constructions of language, genres of literature. The autobiography was first given to us by the ancient Africans, the first autobiography in the world. You see, the autobiography of Winnie. The first philosophers were given to us by the ancient Africans. Harkuf, for example, Kagimni, Ptahhotep. These were philosophers who lived at least 2,000 years before the first Greek philosopher, who was Thales. So the problem is we don't know about this, and they don't teach this in school.
Okay, and that's exactly what we want to pick up on, Dr. Asante, is how is it that I can go through high school, college, and graduate school, and unless I went out and found books written by scholars like yourself, I would not know this information. We're going to talk about that. But we're going to take a break right here. We're going to chat some more with this very interesting man, Dr. Asante, right after this Black Facts. Stay with us. Dr. Asante, the structure of our education here in America, and I guess throughout Western civilization, is built on the foundations of the great Greek and Roman civilizations. What's wrong with that insofar as it relates to African Americans or people of African descent as well as people in general?
Well, the United States of America, of course, is a heterogeneous nation. It's a pluralistic nation. It is a multicultural nation. It has never been a monocultural society. And so what's wrong with the way education is constructed in this society is that it is constructed on a monocultural basis. In other words, what has happened is that whites have developed an educational system which really starts with them. But of course, they're not the only people in the society. And we don't have an education system that is based on looking at a holistic picture of human culture. And so to start with Greece and Rome, which are very young civilizations compared, for example, to the African civilizations of Kemet, Egypt, and Nubia, and the Asian civilization of China and India, both really, actually. To start with Greece and Rome is really not to start with antiquity. It is to assume a starting place and to begin a construction of knowledge based on that, as if that is all you need to know. And of course, that is not all we need to know. I mean, if you only know that, you don't know very much. In fact, not only do you not know very much, you have a very distorted view of education, of knowledge, of culture, and you have almost no facts at all about the African past or African history or African people.
Mm-hmm. I've heard you say on a lecture circuit, because, you know, I've followed you around quite a bit, and I've heard you say a number of times that African-American students sit in the classroom, yet they sit outside of the classroom experience. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean they don't have a sense of ownership of the knowledge that's being presented in the classroom. The child sits in a mathematics class and believes that mathematics came from somebody else. That child doesn't believe that mathematics is derived out of her own history or his own history. I mean, when in fact, the earliest books of mathematics are African books, the Rhind Papyrus and the Moscow Papyrus. In fact, the earliest known mathematical abacus, calculator, was developed by the Assange people of Zaire 28,000 years ago. So this is an African mathematical tool. But if you're sitting in a mathematics class and you're an African-American person and you feel that somehow math is something you have to go get because African-Americans or African people never experienced or developed mathematics, then your education is a poor education. You don't understand that all human beings have contributed to the various disciplines. So when the Latino child sits in the classroom, that child has to feel ownership of the information. When the African child sits in the classroom, that child has to feel ownership, just like the white child who sits in the classroom, whatever the field is. If it's literature, if it's social studies, if it's fine arts. Philosophy.
Give me some examples of philosophy.
Well, if in a philosophy class, I mean, what happens is that you have people will start with you with Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, as if there are no Indian philosophers, no Chinese philosophers, no African philosophers. And consequently, if you're educated in that system, it really educates you for white supremacy. It does not educate you to live in a heterogeneous, pluralistic, multicultural society. And so consequently, you have black people who become Clarence-sized. I mean, like Clarence Thomas. I mean, they're educated in a sense away from themselves, you see.
Now, what do you mean by Clarence-sized? I've heard you say that before.
Well, I just said it. I mean, these are African people who believe, in a sense, that they have no history separate from white people, that there is no tradition, historical or cultural, of African people outside of what they see white people having. So they see themselves as an imitation of white people.
Mm-hmm. Give me an example of what you feel classical music is.
I mean, it's simple. It's African-American music, jazz. That's, to me,
it's not Bach, it's not Beethoven.
Well, that's a classical too, but that's a European classical.
Okay.
The classical is not a term that can be simply captured by one particular people and held. I mean, when someone and held as if it tightly, as if, wow, that's classical. I mean, part of what has happened in our education is that people have the imposition of the European worldview has been such that they have imposed themselves in a universal frame on everything. So if you say classical music, people normally think of European music. Well, that's one classical music. It's not. I mean, there's Japanese classical. I mean, there's the classical music of the United States is jazz.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Asante, what's it going to take? I mean, you're obviously a very learned man and spent quite a bit of time gaining that knowledge. What's it going to take to get this kind of information in our high schools and colleges and universities?
We're moving on that now. I mean, there are a number of publishers, you know, there are a number of publishers, particularly Africa World Press and People's Publishing Group, who are doing an intensive development right now of books and articles just for this purpose. I mean, it's necessary for the whole society, not just for African Americans. I mean, this is an American problem, and it's an American issue. I mean, it's a vision of the society, how we live with each other, how we respect each other, how we understand each other. This is information that we all ought to have access to.
Time is very much of the essence. Why don't you tell me, what are the negative ramifications of...
There are none. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, okay. And insofar as whites, or within our society, of getting a one-sided depiction of history.
Yeah, I thought you were going to say what I was saying. No, but the negative side of that, I mean, is that if whites get a one-sided picture, then they do not know the whole truth. I mean, you have to have all the parts, and we all have to have all the parts. Certainly African Americans have access to white information. White people rarely have access to information about Africa and African people. In fact, even the most learned do not sometimes have information. And so their learnedness is not learnedness in terms of a holism. It is only a particular knowledge.
Mm-hmm. And let me just say this, as always, we welcome your comments, your constructive criticism, and program ideas. And you can write to us at the address on your screen. The address will be repeated during the credits at the end of our program. And we'd like to thank our guest here, Dr. Molefe Kete Asante. You got it going.